Noravans had spent 11 years learning how to disappear, and on the coldest night of the year, a single sound from the tree line undid all of it in one breath. She had been a rescue swimmer, and then something quieter and harder in the service. Work that had no name on any resume and left no medals a person could show. And she had come home to the high country wanting nothing but silence and the weight of snow on a roof. But when she found the 3 shivering shapes half buried in the ditch below her cabin, she made a choice she could not take back, and that choice would drag a buried cruelty out into the light, and without her permission, begin to thaw the frozen thing behind her ribs. Remember that whatever else you forget by the end of this, the rescue is never one direction. What you carry into the dark carries you back out. The storm came down off the ridge the way it always did in late December, sideways and mean. And it found the seams of the world one by one. It pried at the flashing on the roof, it stacked itself against the north wall, it laid the pines over like penitents, and then let them stand, and then laid them over again. Nora stood on the porch of the cabin she had bought with cash and a false calm, and she watched the wind do its work, with the detachment of a woman who had watched worse weather try harder. She was 41 years old, and she moved like someone who had learned that stillness was cheaper than trust and safer than hope. The cold pressed against the glass behind her, and the cold pressed against her face in front of her, and she stood between the two colds and felt nothing she was willing to name aloud, because naming a thing gave it permission to grow. In her jacket pocket, against her chest, she carried a small brass compass with a cracked face, and it grew heavier when the wind rose the way certain objects do when they are asked to hold more than their weight. She did not take it out. She never took it out. She only pressed her palm flat against the outside of the pocket and let the cracked glass bite the memory back down into the dark where she kept it. The dog beside her lifted his head. He was an old shepherd mix named Boone, gray at the muzzle, arthritic in the hips, gone slow in the way that good dogs go slow, which is to say, only in the body and never in the attention. He was a veteran of nothing but his own long loyalty, and he had appointed himself the sole and permanent auditor of every sound Nora would rather have ignored. He stood, which cost him something now. A small grunt of effort she pretended not to hear, because he would have been embarrassed, and he faced the tree line, and he made a low sound in his chest that was not a growl and was not a whine, but was the noise a good dog makes when the world has gone wrong somewhere out past what a person can hear. Nora had learned a long time ago that Boone was never wrong about the direction of trouble. He was frequently wrong about its importance, in her opinion, and she was frequently wrong about that, in his. It was an old argument between them, conducted entirely in glances and silences, and he was winning it now, the way he usually did in the end. "It's a storm," she told him. "Things move in a storm. Branches, snow off the limbs, deer looking for a low spot." Boone did not dignify this with a response. He simply kept looking, and his stillness was an accusation, and his ears stayed forward, and after a moment, Nora sighed the long sigh of a woman who knows she has already lost the argument and is only negotiating the terms of her surrender. She went back inside for the big flashlight, and the coat that meant business and not comfort, the heavy one with the taped seams, and she stamped her feet into the boots by the door. And when she came out again, Boone had already gone down the steps into the snow, favoring the bad hip, pointed like a compass needle toward the ditch that ran along the county road below the property line. She followed him because she had never in her life been able to abandon anything that trusted her enough to lead. That was the flaw in her, or the last good thing in her, and she had never been able to decide which, and on this night it would turn out to be both. The snow was to her shins, and the wind took the flashlight beam and shredded it into useless white. And for a while there was nothing out there but the pale mouth of the ditch swallowing everything she pointed at. The cold got into her teeth. It got into the old ache in her left shoulder that woke whenever the temperature dropped past a certain line. a souvenir of a night in another kind of water. She kept moving because Boone kept moving, his gray shape ahead of her fading in and out of the driving snow, and twice she nearly called him back, and twice she didn't. And later, she would understand that those 2 moments of not calling him back were the hinges on which the whole rest of her life would swing. Then Boone stopped, and he lowered his head, and he did the thing that turned Nora's stomach cold, in a way the weather never could. He lay down in the snow, gently, deliberately, the way he used to lie down beside things that were hurt so as not to frighten them further. And he began, very softly, to whine. They were in the culvert where the road ran over the seasonal creek, 3 of them, pressed into the frozen mud and into each other. And at first, Nora thought they were already gone, that Boone had led her out into the storm to keep vigil over the dead. They were puppies, no more than 7 or 8 weeks by the size of them, some short-coated shepherd cross with too much leg and not enough fat on their small ribs, and someone had put them into a feed sack and thrown the sack from a moving vehicle into the ditch to die in the cold. She could read it all from the evidence. The way you read a scene when reading scenes has been your work. The sack had caught on the sharp lip of the culvert and torn. 2 of them had crawled out into the mud, 1 had not. There were drag marks in the frozen slush, small ones, where the 2 had tried and failed to pull the 3rd along with them, because even at 8 weeks a dog will not easily leave its own behind, and that detail nearly took Nora's knees out from under her, and she filed it away in the place where she kept the things she could not afford to feel yet. She knelt in the snow and put her bare hand against the nearest small body, and she felt, faint and slow and stubborn, the tick of a heart that had not yet made up its mind. She counted. It was a thing she did without deciding to, a habit worn so deep into her by a life of triage that it ran without her, the arithmetic of the living and the dead. 3 puppies, 2 breathing, 1 so cold it had gone past, shivering into the terrible peace that comes before the end. The stillness that fools amateurs into thinking the worst is over when the worst is only beginning. She did not let herself feel it. She let herself work. That was the trick, the only trick she had ever needed, the wall between the hands and the heart that let the hands keep moving while the heart waited its turn. She opened her coat and put all 3 inside it against the warmth of her own body, the living and the nearly gone alike. And she felt their cold like a burn against her stomach, and she stood up with her arms full of dying, and she said to Boone, to the storm, to no one, to the God she had stopped speaking to years ago, "Okay. Okay, we've got you." That was the moment. She would think about it later, in the slow gray weeks that followed, and she would understand that a door she had welded shut a long time ago had come open in that ditch, silently, without her consent, and that once it was open, she would not be able to weld it again, no matter how much of herself she spent trying. She had chosen the living thing in front of her over the instinct to keep her hands empty and her heart unbilled, and a hand that is willing to hold something can be held. She did not know that yet. She only knew that she was running badly uphill, through the deepening snow, with an old dog struggling gamely at her heels, and 3 small hearts against her sternum, and that if any of them were going to live, it was going to be because of what she did in the next 10 minutes, and not one thing more. Inside, she did what she knew, and it was a great deal. She built the fire up until the stove ticked and roared, and she filled 2 hot water bottles and wrapped them in towels because bare heat against a hypothermic body does more harm than good, and she made a nest in a laundry basket set close to the stove. She rubbed the 2 breathing ones dry, roughly, briskly, the way the cold needed and not the way tenderness wanted, working the circulation back into the tiny limbs while they mewled in protest, which was a good sound, the best sound, the sound of a body deciding it would rather be uncomfortable than dead. She warmed sugar water on the stove and dribbled it into the sides of their mouths with the corner of a clean cloth, drop by patient drop, because a cold gut cannot handle much at once. The little one, the cold one, she could not treat like the others because the others had a fight in them, and this one had none left. So she peeled up her own shirt and held it against the bare skin of her stomach, skin to skin, the oldest medicine there is. And she talked to it. Low and even and steady. And she was not a woman who talked, and she did it anyway. She told it the truth, which was that she was not sure, that she had lost small ones before who had less wrong with them than this. And she told it the lie that all rescuers tell, the necessary one, which was that it was going to be fine, that it just had to hold on, that she had it now and she was not going to let go. Somewhere in the first hour the cold one's heart found its footing, and the shivering came back, violent and total and beautiful, the whole small body shaking itself back toward the world. And Nora put her forehead down against the top of the wet little head, and she did not cry because she had forgotten how, somewhere along the way, but her breath came out of her in one long shudder that was the closest thing she had left to weeping, and it emptied something out of her that had been full a long time. By midnight there were 3 of them, breathing in the basket, 3 small survivors of a night that had been engineered to kill them. She sat on the floor with her back against the couch, and Boone stretched out beside her, with his gray chin on her thigh, taking credit correctly for the entire operation. Thaw. She looked at the 3 of them heaped in the firelight, rising and falling with the ordinary miracle of breath, and she felt the strangest sensation, one she distrusted immediately and reflexively, which was that the cabin was less empty than it had been that morning, and that she did not entirely hate it. She pushed the feeling down. Feelings, in her long and hard experience, were expensive, and they arrived with bills attached that came due at the worst hours. But the feeling did not go all the way down, and she knew it did not, and she looked at Boone, and Boone looked back at her with the flat and patient certainty of a creature who has been telling you the same thing for years and is quietly pleased that you have finally begun to listen. It was when she moved the last puppy, the one that had nearly died, to settle it deeper into the towels that she found, the thing that turned a mercy into a mystery. Around its neck, under the loose folds of puppy skin, there was a band. Not a collar. A thin loop of hard plastic, the kind used to tag livestock and equipment and things that are counted rather than loved, cinched too tight and half grown into the fur so that removing it would take a careful blade, and on it a string of stamped numbers and 2 letters and a small logo she recognized because everyone in the county recognized it. A stylized pine tree. Inside a circle. She sat very still and looked at that little pine tree in the firelight for a long time, and outside the storm leaned its full weight on the walls of the cabin, and she understood, without being able to say quite how she understood it, that the night was not over and would not be over for a long time, that she had picked up the loose end of something that ran back a long way into the dark. Because the pine tree in the circle belonged to a man named Garrett Cole, who owned half the valley, and who had never, in his entire polished life, been thrown into a ditch by anyone. Nora did not sleep that night, though she lay down and pretended to for Boone's sake. Because he worried, and a dog who worries does not rest, and she owed him his rest. She lay on the floor, beside the basket, with her hand resting on the warm heap of them so she would feel it in her palm. The instant the breathing changed, and she watched the numbers on that plastic band swim behind her closed eyes. She had spent a decade learning to read a situation for what it was, underneath what it pretended to be, to strip the story off a thing and see the bones. And every read she took of this one came back the same. Someone with tagged, recorded, cataloged animals had thrown 3 of them away to freeze in a ditch, not abandoned in a moment of desperation, not surrendered at a shelter door in shame, discarded. Disposed of. Like inventory that had failed inspection and was no longer worth the feed it cost. The word inventory sat down in the middle of her mind and would not leave, and it was an ugly word to set next to a heartbeat. And the ugliness of it kept her eyes open until the window went from black to the bruised gray of a mountain dawn. Garrett Cole was the kind of man who washed his hands before and after he shook yours. He owned a big spread on the south end of the valley, an operation he called a rescue and rehabilitation ranch, and he had a foundation with his name on it, and a wing of the county hospital with his name on it, and a smile that arrived a half-second before the rest of him did, the way a salesman's does. He sponsored the Youth League and the Volunteer Fire Fund and the high school scholarship, and he stood up at the county fair every August in a pressed shirt and talked in a warm, rolling voice about second chances for broken creatures, and the whole valley loved him for it, and why would they not? Nora had met him exactly once, at the feed store, and had disliked him with an instinct so immediate and so total that she had been ashamed of it afterward and had chalked it up to her own damage. Boone had disliked him too, right there in the aisle, a low, steady disapproval, and Boone was never wrong about the direction of trouble. She thought about that now in the gray light. She thought about the smile that arrived a half-second early, like a man rehearsing sincerity in a mirror, and she thought about a little stamped pine tree, grown into the neck of a dying dog, and the two thoughts fit together with a click she felt in her back teeth. In the full gray of morning the storm broke, exhausted, and left the world white and blank and blinding, every edge of it softened, and every sound of it muffled. Nora fed the puppies from a bottle. She improvised out of a squirt bottle and a cut rubber nipple, and she watched them fight for it with the ferocious single-minded will of the very young, kneading at nothing with their paws, and she thought, against her better judgment and all her rules, that they were going to make it. All three of them, 2 boys and a little female with one ear that flopped and one that stood. And it was the female who had nearly died against her stomach, and it was the female Nora caught herself watching the longest, and she made herself stop. You do not name what you cannot keep. That was a rule. She had a great many rules, and most of them were fences. She had built to keep the world from getting a good clear look at her, and she was about to find out how well they held under a load they were never built to carry. She was cleaning the basket and running the numbers on the band through her memory again, when the knock came at the door. It was a hard knock, official, 3 raps, and a pause, the knock of someone who does it for a living. And Boone was up and barking before the second rap landed, and Nora's whole body went to a place it had not needed to go in years, low and ready and cold and very quiet. She had not called anyone. No one knew what was in her cabin. No one came up her road ever, not the mail, not the neighbors, not the county, because that absence of visitors was the entire point of the road and the reason she had paid what she had paid for it. She crossed to the window and looked out and saw the county SUV in the drive with its light bar dark, and a deputy standing on her porch in a heavy coat with his breath smoking in the cold. And she did not open the door right away, because a lifetime of hard training does not open doors right away, not for anyone, not for anything. The deputy knocked again, and then he said, "Through the wood," in a voice that was tired and careful and not unkind, a voice with the sand of many long shifts in it. "Miss Vance? Noravans, I need a few minutes of your time. I'm not here to cause you any trouble." And Nora stood frozen in the middle of her own front room, one hand drifting to the pocket with the compass in it, because she had told no living soul in this entire valley her last name. She opened the door with Boone pressed hard against her leg, and the deputy took a small, deliberate step back, giving her space, giving her the doorway and the daylight and a clear line to close it again. The way people who have been hurt themselves give room to other people they suspect have been hurt. She read him, the way she read everything, fast and total. In the first 2 seconds, he was in his 50s, broad through the shoulders and going soft at the middle, in the way of a man who used to be very hard and had let a little of it go, with a face that had spent 30 years learning that most trouble was smaller than it first appeared and had recently painfully learned. His nameplate said, Reyes. His eyes went past her, once, professionally, without seeming to move at all, to the basket by the stove and the small heap of puppies in it, and something moved across his face that he did not let settle into an expression. "Deputy Marcus Reyes," he said. "Sheriff's office. I'm sorry to come up on you cold like this, first thing, in this weather. How do you know my name?" Nora said. It was not a question the way she said it. It was a door she was holding half shut with the toe of her boot. Reyes exhaled, and the breath hung in the cold air between them like a small ghost. And he seemed to weigh something and then decide to spend it. "Because your name's written in a notebook," he said. "That came into my possession yesterday in a way I can't fully explain to you standing here on your porch freezing, and your name is on a page with about 40 others. And every other name on that page belongs to somebody who's dead or who left this valley in a hurry or who won't return my calls and shuts the door in my face. You are the only person on that entire list I could actually find and get to open up." He looked at her steadily, without flinching from the cold red she was giving him. "So, can I come in? And Miss Vance? And because I think you found something last night that I have been trying to find for 2 years, and I think you may not even know yet how much it's worth." Nora looked at the notebook he had not yet shown her, and at the honesty he was clearly rationing, and she looked down at Boone, who had stopped bristling and had sat down on the threshold, which was the closest thing Boone ever came to issuing a security clearance to a stranger, and she stepped back and let the deputy into her house. She sat him at the kitchen table and put coffee in front of him, that she apologized for, and he drank anyway, without complaint. And she brought the plastic band over and set it on the scarred wood between them, without a word. And Deputy Reyes went very still when he saw the little pine tree in the circle. He did not touch it. He set his coffee down and he took a photograph of it with his phone, from 3 careful angles, and only then did he take it up in a small plastic bag he produced from an inside pocket of his coat, and Nora watched him do all of it, and revised her opinion of him upward. 2. Because a man who bags evidence properly on a stranger's kitchen table is a man who intends to make something stick, and knows how easily things come unstuck. He was the kind of officer who believed in the slow, tedious, unglamorous machinery of proof, and she would come to be grateful for that belief more than once before this was over, and she would also come to understand that it was the exact opposite of what she herself was tempted toward, which was the fast, clean answer. The door kicked in at midnight.
Yes.
The reckoning delivered by her own 2 hands? Wah! Reyes would spend the coming weeks holding her back from that, patiently, immovably, and he would be right to do it, and she would hate him for it in the moment. And much later, she would thank him for it, and mean it. 2 years ago, Reyes said, turning the coffee cup slowly in his broad hands, a man named Danny Osei worked out at the Cole Ranch. Kennel manager. A good hand, everybody said. Gentle with the animals, careful, honest to a fault. Quiet man, he was married to a woman named Priya, who ran the vet clinic down in town. You following me? Nora nodded. Danny found something out at that ranch that he didn't like. And instead of quitting, or looking away, which is what most men do, he started writing it down. Numbers, dates, what came in the gate, and what went out of it, and the difference between the two, which was the whole thing, the whole rotten heart of it, sitting right there in the difference. And then one morning Danny drove his truck off the switchback above the reservoir, and the county medical examiner called it an accident. Ice on the road, and the sheriff at the time signed off on it without much of a look, and Danny Osei got put in the ground as a careless man who took a mountain curve too fast. You don't think it was ice, Nora said. I know it was ice, Reyes said. There was ice all over that road that morning. I saw it myself. I don't think he was the one driving. He set the cup down flat. Priya has been telling anybody who would sit still for it, for 2 years now, that her husband didn't have a careless bone in his entire body, that he was the kind of man who slowed down for the deer crossing when there weren't any deer, and that somebody out at that ranch is running something ugly under the cover of a rescue. And for 2 years nobody listened to her, and I have to count myself in that number, God help me, because Garrett Cole gives more money to this county in a year than the county manages to raise for itself. And it is a hard thing to look a man like that in the eye and accuse him of murder when he just cut the check for the new ambulance that everybody's grandmother is riding around in. He looked down at the bag band on the table, and quote. And then yesterday, somebody left Danny's working notebook in the cab of my truck in a plain grocery sack while I was inside eating lunch. And your name is in it, Miss Vance, on the very last page, in the back, written in a different hand than all the rest, added late, and I would purely love to know why. Nora did not answer right away, because she was doing arithmetic, and the arithmetic was ugly. Someone had written her name in a dead man's notebook, and then left that notebook for the one apparently honest deputy in the county to find, and she had lived on this ridge for 2 full years in the settled belief that she was invisible, unfindable, erased from every list, and she was not. And that single fact settled over her shoulders like a second cold coming down through the first. But underneath the fear, and she noticed this with something close to surprise, there was another thing rising up through her, an old thing she had believed she had left behind in the ocean years ago. It felt like purpose. It felt exactly like that moment on the pitching deck of a rolling ship at night, when the swimmer looks down at the black water she is about to go into and stops being afraid of it, because there is a person out there in the swells, and the person is the only thing in the whole world that matters now, and the fear simply has nowhere left to stand. She had believed that part of her was dead and buried, with everything else she had buried. It turned out it had only been asleep, curled up in the cold, waiting for a sound from the tree line to wake it. "I don't know why my name's in the book," she said. "I don't like that it is. But I know what's out at that ranch now, or I know part of it. I know what a discarded animal looks like, deputy, because I spent last night pulling 3 of them out of a ditch in a feed sack, and one of them had a company tag grown into its neck." She looked over at the basket, and the little female with the flop ear lifted her head at exactly that moment and looked back, as if she had understood that the conversation had turned to the fact of her survival. "Somebody is breeding at scale out there and culling the ones that don't sell, disposing of them, and dressing the whole operation up as a charitable rescue for the tax write-off, and the goodwill and the applause at the county fair. And when a kennel man started quietly writing down the numbers that didn't add up, that man drove off a cliff." She heard her own voice go flat and level, dropping into the register it used to find when things were about to become very serious and very fast. "That about the shape of it?" "That's the shape of it," Reyes said quietly. "I just can't prove one piece of it in a way that survives a good lawyer in a courtroom, and Cole has the best lawyers in 3 counties on a retainer, and every single piece of paper out at that ranch swears up and down that the man is a living saint." He tapped the table once with a thick finger. "What I have got is a dead witness and a grieving widow that half the town thinks is unhinged with sorrow, and a notebook with no chain of custody worth a damn, and now a plastic band off a puppy somebody threw in a ditch. What I need is one clean thread that the lawyers cannot cut, one thing that pulls the whole sweater apart. And I need people around me who will not scare off when it gets ugly, because it is going to get ugly." He looked at her, and his tired eyes were far shrewder than they had first appeared under the porch light. "That notebook says you were a Navy rescue swimmer, and then something afterward that a person doesn't put on a resume. It says you know how to keep your nerve when the water's coming over the rail. I don't know who wrote that about you, or how in the world they knew it, but I find myself inclined to believe it, on the strength of the fact that you have held this entire conversation for 15 minutes now without once telling me to get the hell off your porch." Nora almost smiled. She caught it just before it reached her mouth and put it back. "Who's the widow?" she said. "Priya. She's still down at the clinic. She is. Hasn't left the valley. Won't. Mult. Says she's not going anywhere until somebody carves the right word on Danny's stone." "Then that is where we start," Nora said, and she was already up out of the chair, already reaching for the coat that meant business and not comfort. And Boone was already at the door, with his tail low and ready, and 3 puppies in a laundry basket watched a woman who had spent 11 years learning how to disappear decide, without quite noticing that she was deciding it to be seen. Mercy is a door that only opens outward. She had opened it to let 3 small freezing lives in out of the storm. She had not understood, not yet, that opening it would also let her own self out. Priya Ose ran the valley's only veterinary clinic out of a converted feed store on the edge of town, and she was small and sharp and precise in every motion, and she had the particular stillness of a person who has been grieving so long and so publicly and so unheard that she has burned clean through all the softer expressions and has only the hard, clear lines left in her. When Nora came in carrying the basket, with Reyes a step behind her, and Boone limping in at her side, Priya looked into the basket first, before she looked at either of the two humans, and she went white to the lips, and she reached in and lifted the little flop-eared female, and turned her over with practiced hands and found the banded scar on the neck under the fur, and she made a sound low in her throat that had no words anywhere in it, a sound like a hinge that has not been opened in a very long time. Then she looked up at Nora, with eyes that had been waiting 2 years to find someone, anyone, who would not turn around and walk back out the door. "Where?" she said. Just the one word. "Ditch by the county road, up under the culvert where the creek runs through," Nora said, in a feed sack. "2 of them came through it fine. This one nearly didn't. She's the reason I'm standing here." Priya set the puppy down again, with a tenderness that was almost violent in the care of it, and she wiped her hand slowly on her coat, and she said to Reyes, not to Nora, in a voice gone very steady, "The number. Read me the number off the band." And Reyes took out his phone and read it off, the string of stamped digits and the 2 letters after them, and Priya closed her eyes and recited it back to him, the whole string, before he had even finished. And then she turned and went to a locked drawer in the back and took out a photocopy of a single page, worn as soft as cloth from 2 years of handling. And she laid it flat on the stainless exam table and pressed it smooth and pointed, and there it was, the same number, in her dead husband's small square handwriting, sitting in a column of hundreds of others. Danny copied out 3 full years of Cole's intake and disposition logs before they ever caught on to what he was doing, she said. The animals that came in, the ones that went out to real homes, with real adoption paperwork, real families, and the ones that just stopped existing between one page and the next. He kept the original notebook hidden somewhere, I never knew, and he carried a working copy on him, and he was building it into something no one could argue with. When he died, the original vanished from wherever he had put it, and I tore this valley apart looking and never found it. All I ever had was this one photocopied page that he'd made for me to keep somewhere safe, and everybody I showed it to told me it proved exactly nothing. Her finger stayed pressed on the number. And now this is the missing original, coming back to me. 1 dog at a time. Do you understand? This is Danny. He is handing it to us out of the ground. Nora looked down at the page, at the columns of small, precise numbers marching down it, at the terrible widening gap between the intake column and the adoption column. A gap that meant hundreds upon hundreds of living animals unaccounted for across 3 years, and she understood the true scale of the thing for the first time. And it made her pull out a chair and sit down in it. She had spent the entire night saving 2 lives and losing none, and here on a metal table was a ledger of loss so vast that it stopped being a number at all and became a kind of weather, a climate of cruelty. And a quiet, careful man had written it all down, in pencil, over 3 years, at his own kitchen table after his shifts, and had died for the arithmetic of it. She looked up at Priya Ose, who had lost her husband and kept his math against every discouragement, and she felt the last of her professional distance come off her all at once, the way ice comes off a wing in a sudden sheet when the plane climbs into warmer air. "Okay," Nora said. "Tell me everything, from the very beginning, every piece of it, whether you think it matters or not. And then the 3 of us are going to build something that survives a lawyer." The weeks that followed were not the kind that make a good story if a story wants speed. And Reyes told them so, plainly and often, more than once, whenever Nora's jaw set and her eyes went to the south end of the valley. Justice out here did not arrive on a horse at a gallop. It arrived by certified mail, and it arrived in triplicate, and it arrived so slowly you could forget it was coming at all, and the only way to make it arrive at all was to do the boring, careful, thankless work of stacking one verifiable fact on top of another, and then another, until the stack stood too tall for even Garrett Cole's lawyers to knock down without the whole town watching them try. So that is exactly what the three of them did. Priya matched Danny's photocopied numbers against the county's own public records, against Cole's tax filings, against the foundation's published grant reports, against the mandatory intake reports the ranch was required by law to file with the state, and everywhere the numbers should have agreed, they disagreed. And every single disagreement was one more small, clean thread. Reyes, quietly, off the clock, on his own time and his own gas, so that no one could ever say he had made it official before it was ready to be official, drove the back roads and tracked down two former ranch hands who had left the valley in a hurry 2 winters before, and who were willing now, from a safe distance, with the doors locked, to say into a recorder what they had seen with their own eyes. And Nora did the thing she was built for, which was to sit still in the cold and watch, patient as a swimmer treading water and waiting for the right swell to carry her in, and to keep 3 growing puppies alive through the fragile weeks, and to keep the old dog warm. And above all, to keep her nerve when the waiting stretched long and her hands itched for the fast answer. She named them. Of course she did. She had told herself flatly that she would not, and then she did it anyway, somewhere in the 2nd week. Because you cannot bottle feed a life 4 times a night, through the small dark hours, and go on calling it a number. The 2 boys she named Ash and Cedar. For the trees, because they were rooted and stubborn and growing fast. The little female with the flop ear, the one that had nearly died against a bare skin of her stomach in the first hour, she named halyard, which is the rope on a sailing ship that raises and lowers the sail, the single line you trust with the whole standing rig. And she did not let herself examine too closely why she had reached all the way back into the sea for that name. Back into the life she had walled off. Halyard slept curled against Nora's neck, her flop ear against the pulse there. Ash and Cedar slept in a squirming pile with Boone, who tolerated the both of them with the martyred and long-suffering dignity of an old soldier who has been reassigned, against his wishes and his rank, to run a daycare, and who was, Nora observed with quiet astonishment, 10 years younger behind the eyes than he had been in December. She caught herself once, at 3 in the morning, sitting on the cold kitchen floor, with a bottle in one hand and a warm puppy sprawled across her chest and the old dog's heavy head resting on her knee, and she caught herself smiling in the dark, an expression her face had very nearly forgotten the shape of, and she pressed her free hand flat against the pocket where the cracked brass compass lived, and for the first time, in a long time, it did not feel so heavy against her. They came for her on a Tuesday, the way the smooth ones always do, which is to say they did not come themselves and never would. A truck she did not recognize sat idling at the bottom of her road one morning, and was gone by the afternoon, and there were fresh tire tracks in the mud that turned around in her lower gate. A rock came through the front window of Priya's clinic in the night, with a piece of paper rubber banded around it that said, in careful block letters so no handwriting could be read, "Let the dead rest." And Priya swept up the glass and taped a square of cardboard over the hole, and photographed the rock and the note from every angle and bagged them both, and drove them straight to Reyes, because she had learned from the worst thing that ever happened to her exactly how much a single piece of documented, dated, photographed evidence was worth. And she had decided long ago that it was worth a great deal more than her fear. And then, on a bright, hard morning, at the end of that same week, Garrett Cole himself came up Nora's road, alone, in a clean white truck without a speck of mud on it, and he got out with his hands open and his smile arriving its customary half-second early, and he stood in her yard as if he already owned the frozen ground under his own boots. She would learn only later he had recently and very quietly tried to buy out from under her. "From the county, Miss Vance," he said warmly. "I don't believe we've ever properly had the pleasure, Garrett Cole." He did not offer his hand to shake, which told her he had been warned about the dog, which told her someone had been watching her long enough to know about the dog. "I understand you rescued some animals during that terrible storm we had. I wanted to come up and thank you personally for that. That's exactly the kind of thing this whole valley is built on." Neighbors looking out. His eyes moved over the cabin as he talked, over the woodpile and the truck and the single set of tracks, cataloging everything, pricing it, filing it. "I run a rescue operation myself, as I'm sure you've heard. I'd be more than glad to take those pups off your hands and get them the professional veterinary care they really deserve, save you all the trouble and the expense of raising them up out here on your own." Nora stood on her porch with Boone pressed hard and low against her leg, and Halyard, 4 months old now, and all legs and enormous ears, poking her nose out around the door behind her. And she looked down at the man who had thrown this exact dog into a ditch to freeze, and had now driven all the way up her mountain to collect the survivor. And she felt the old cold come up in her, the swimmer's cold, the one that is the opposite of fear, the one that makes everything slow down and go very clear. "They're not any trouble at all," she said pleasantly. "And they're not for handing over to anybody." Cole's smile did not move a muscle, but something behind it shifted like a load settling. "It's a hard thing up here all alone," he said, and his voice was smooth as a fresh coat of paint laid down over old rot. "Long roads, bad weather most of the year. A person could get themselves into some trouble up here, and nobody would know a thing about it for days and days. I'd surely hate to see anything happen to a woman living all by herself so far up and out of the way." He let that hang in the cold air between them. "The offer's a genuine kindness, Ms. Vance. If I were in your boots, I believe I'd take the kindness while it's being offered." "I heard you," Nora said. "Now you hear me. You're standing on my road, on ground you don't own, no matter how hard you tried. My dog doesn't care for you, and my dog has never once in his life been wrong about the direction of trouble. So you're going to get back into your clean white truck and go on down the hill." She did not raise her voice at all. She had learned a long time ago, in the worst rooms of her life, that the quietest voice in a confrontation is almost always the one that has already decided how the thing is going to end. And, "Mr. Cole, the dead don't rest. They keep books." She watched that land in him. She watched him understand, in one small involuntary flick of his eyes, toward the cabin, that she knew all of it. That the notebook was out of its hiding place and moving, and that the widow he had dismissed, as mad with grief, had not scared off, and neither had this one. He got back into his truck without one more word, and his easy smile was gone entirely by the time he had backed and turned, and Nora stood on her porch, still and straight, until the sound of the engine had died away all the way down at the bottom of the valley, and only then did she go inside and sit down hard in the kitchen chair. Because her hands had started to shake, and she wanted them to do it in private. Halyard scrambled up into her lap and pressed the flop ear flat against Nora's sternum. Over the drumming heart there, and Boone leaned his whole gray weight against her side. And Nora let her forehead come down to rest on the top of the puppy's warm head, and she breathed. Name the place, the cabin, home, mine. Name the scents. Warm fur under her chin, wood smoke in the air, the fast light tick of a small brave heart against her breastbone. Name the voice. Her own, low and even, saying, "Okay, okay, we've got you." It was the grounding ritual she used to come all the way back from the far cold places her mind still went without asking her permission, and she used it now, deliberately, one anchor at a time, and it held, and she stayed in the present, in the warmth, with the living, breathing weight of them against her, and she did not go under. Though the water had come right up over the rail, then things moved fast, the way slow things do at the very end when they finally break all at once. The two former ranch hands, hearing quietly that others had already come forward, and that they would not be standing alone, agreed at last to go on the full record with the state, not just onto Reyes's private recorder. The state, on the strength of that, sent an inspector out to the ranch. and the inspector was turned away at the gate and came back inside of a week with a warrant in his hand, because Reyes had by then stacked his facts high enough and clean enough that a judge could no longer pretend the stack was not standing right there in the middle of the room. And on a gray raw morning in early spring, a repentant man named Wes Tran, who had kept Garrett Cole's books for 11 years and had helped hide the numbers inside them and had not slept a full night through in 2 of those years, walked into the sheriff's office on his own 2 feet with a cardboard box held against his chest and set it down on the counter and said in a voice worn to nothing that he wanted to tell somebody the whole truth before he died of the weight of carrying it. Inside the box was the original notebook, the real one, in Danny O'Sea's own small square hand, cover to cover, every page of 3 years. Wes had taken it from the ranch office the night Danny died, because he had known, God forgive him, he had known what was going to happen on that switchback before it happened, and he had not been brave enough to stop it, only brave enough, at the very last and 2 full years too late, to save the evidence of it from being destroyed. He was the one who had left the working copy in the cab of Reyes's truck that day and had been trying to find the rest of his courage ever since in the bottom of a bottle and the back of a church and the long sleepless dark. And now, at last, on a gray morning in spring, he had found it. It had cost him everything, and it had come very late, but he had found it. The confrontation, when it finally came, did not come in a courtroom the way Nora had half expected it would. It came out at the ranch, on the very day the warrant was served, when the state inspectors and Reyes and 2 uniformed state officers went in through the front gate, and Garrett Cole, who had spent his entire life being the smoothest and most untouchable man in every single room he had ever walked into, discovered all at once that there are some situations no amount of charity and no amount of money and no amount of practiced sincerity will ever smooth over. And he did the thing that the smooth ones do when the polished surface finally cracks straight through, which is that he panicked, and he reached for something ugly. Nora was there, though she was not supposed to be anywhere near it, standing well back by the fender of Reyes's truck at the far edge of the whole scene, because Priya had asked her to come, and Priya's hands had been shaking too hard on the wheel to drive herself. And when Cole came stumbling out of the main barn with a rifle in his hands, because a cornered man will always reach for the cruelest tool within reach of his fingers, it was Boone who moved first. Old Boone, arthritic and gray and slow, faster in that one instant than he had any earthly right to be. Throwing his whole gray body across the ground and into the space between the black barrel and the woman who had once followed him into a ditch in a storm. And the shot went wide high into the mud of the paddock, because Nora had already closed the distance the way a rescue swimmer closes the last yards on a drowning man, low and total and without hesitation, and had taken the rifle sideways and out of a soft man's soft hands before he had ever fully understood that she was moving at all. And here was the thing she would carry with her afterward for the rest of her life, the thing she was most quietly proud of, and the thing she understood the least in the moment of doing it. She had Garrett Cole flat on the ground, and the emptied rifle in her own 2 hands, and every year of her hard training screaming a single clean, simple solution up at her from the base of her skull. And she looked down at him, this man who had thrown a dying newborn dog into a freezing ditch, and driven a good and gentle man off a cliff above a reservoir, and stood in her own yard, and threatened her life with that pink smooth voice, and she did not do it. She worked the action and emptied the rifle of its rounds and threw the weapon clear across the mud where no one could reach it, and she put her knee into the small of his back and held him there firmly for the officers who were already running. And she did it because she had come to understand somewhere in the last 3 months, in the warm dark of her kitchen with the bottle in her hand and a saved life breathing against her chest, that the entire point of all of it, the whole reason for any of it, was not to become the cold thing she had come to stop. Mercy is not the absence of anger. Mercy is anger that has finally learned exactly where the line is drawn and has chosen freely not to step across it. She held him gently, which is only to say she held him like a professional and not like a woman with a grievance, and she waited for the men with the badges to reach her, and she did not, in that one crucial closing instant, become the very thing she had crossed the whole valley to stop. Boone had a graze across his shoulder where the near miss had passed him, and a great many strongly held opinions about the indignity of the veterinary visit that followed at Priya's clinic, and he recovered fully and completely from both, and lived another good 2 years after that morning, which is a great deal more than any old dog has ever promised, and more than enough to call it an outright gift. Garrett Cole did not go to prison quickly, because the smooth ones never do, and Reyes had warned them of that from the very first cup of bad coffee. He went slowly, ground down over 18 long months by the same tedious triplicate machinery of the law that Reyes had promised them, through motions and continuances and delays and expensive men in good suits. And in the end, the original notebook and the confession of the bookkeeper and the sworn word of the 2 ranch hands and Priya's 3 patient years of matched and cross-referenced numbers made a stack far too tall for any of them to knock down, and Garrett Cole was convicted on counts of fraud and animal cruelty, done on the strength of Wes Strand's testimony about what he had known before that morning on the switchback, on a charge relating to the death of Danny O'Say, that finally allowed a widow, at long last, to have a different word than careless carved into her husband's stone. It was not a clean victory. Nothing worth having out here ever was. It came slowly, and it came only part way, and it left a very great deal of grief lying exactly where it had always been. But Danny O'Say's name was cleared, publicly, on the record. And that did not bring him back to the woman who had kept his mouth for 2 years. And it did not have to. And that was the hard-bottom truth of the whole thing. Grace does not erase the grief. Grace reorders it. It moves the terrible weight of it off the chest, where it crushes the breath out of you and sets it up onto the shoulders, where a person can carry it a long way and still stand upright and still walk. Priya took ash and cedar in the end, the 2 boys, because she said a clinic that had lost so much ought to have some fool life tearing around underfoot in it again, and because she and Nora had become, in those months, the particular kind of friends who do not need to say very much to one another, true women who had each been hauled up out of deep cold water by the same single stubborn act of mercy, and both of them knew it without either one ever saying it aloud. And Nora kept halyard. Of course she did, because you do not hand back the one rope you have learned to trust with the whole standing rig. She did not release her to the wild, because a dog is not the wild and was never meant for it. But there came a warm day the following summer, when Nora sat on her porch step and watched halyard, grown now and long-limbed and strong and entirely whole, tear flat out across the green meadow below the cabin after absolutely nothing at all, just running, just gloriously and pointlessly alive in the sun. And Nora understood in that moment that she had let something go anyway, in her own fashion, that she had opened her hands all the way and given up her vote on how any of it was ever going to turn out, and that the dog had chosen, out of all the wide bright world it could have run into, to wheel around and come racing back up the hill to her, and that this alone was the only kind of keeping that was ever worth a single thing. A year on from that first cold December night, there was a sanctuary standing at the far south end of the valley, on the very ground where the coal ranch had been, seized and repurposed by the state and run, now, of all the people in the world, by Wes Strand, Aji, who had asked to be allowed to spend whatever years he had left cleaning up the exact mess he had helped to make, and by Priya O'Say, who kept the books there now with a fierce and open and public honesty, every number matched to its neighbor, every animal named and known and accounted for, not one of them ever again allowed to become inventory. They called it the O'Say Refuge, and the name was on a plain wooden sign at the gate, and it meant precisely what it said. Nora sat on the board of it and did not say a great deal at the meetings, which surprised absolutely no one who knew her. Reyes retired from the sheriff's office that same year and turned up at the refuge most mornings anyway, with a thermos of coffee that was, if anything, worse than Nora's, arguing amiably with Boone about the direction of trouble, and losing those arguments mostly, and taking it well. And on a warm gold evening, in the early autumn of that second year, Nora stood out on her own porch, with Halyard leaning her full-grown weight against Nora's leg and old Boone snoring contentedly in the open doorway behind them, and the last long light going gold, and then rose over the top of the ridge. And she reached into her jacket pocket and took out the small, cracked brass compass, the one she had carried against her chest, unopened for 11 long years, and she held it flat in her open palm in the fading light. And for the first time in all those years, it did not feel heavy in her hand. It just felt, finally, like what it plainly was. A small thing that a friend had carried once, in another life, entirely in the salt and the dark and the cold water, and had pressed into her hands at the end, and it had gone on pointing her toward home the whole long way around, through a ditch and a killing storm and a stack of terrible penciled numbers and a soft man with a rifle, all the way to a porch full of the living and the loved. She turned it over once, watching the last light catch in the crack across its face, and she did not feel the old drowning weight of it drag at her chest the way it always had. She closed her hand over it gently, the way she closed her hand over anything she meant to keep and not to crush. And she put it back down into her pocket, and she stayed out there on the porch long after the cold came up out of the meadow until the first hard stars broke out over the black line of the ridge, and she was warm the whole time. Warm from a great deal more than the fading of the day. So here is what I would say to you, whoever you are, hearing this out there in your own storm, on your own cold and unlit road tonight. You may believe, exactly as she believed for 11 long years, that you have made yourself safe by making yourself alone. That the fence you built around your own heart is a kind of wisdom, and the silence inside it a kind of peace. But grief mistaken for safety is still a cage, no matter how well you have furnished it, no matter how good the lock, and the only key that was ever cut to fit that particular cage is a small thing, cold and shivering and half gone, that needs you, that cannot save itself, that arrives asking you to do the one thing you swore you would never do again, which is to open your empty hands. The mercy you are asked to give will not look like a gift when it comes to you. It will look like a burden and a risk and a bill you cannot afford. It will arrive inconvenient and wounded and bleeding, and at the very worst possible hour of the coldest possible night, in a torn feed sack, in a ditch, in the dark, where no reasonable person would ever have gone looking. Save it anyway. Kneel down in the snow and gather it up and carry it inside your own coat against the warmth of your own body, even when you are not sure, even when you have lost ones with less wrong with them than this. Because here is the great secret of it. The one it took an 11-year rescue swimmer 11 more hard years on dry land to finally learn the rescue was never running in only one direction. It never once was. You reach down for the drowning thing in the black water, certain you are the strong one, certain you are the one doing the saving, and its small hand closes around yours, and it pulls, without ever once meaning to, without even knowing that it does it, and it hauls you up, hand over hand, all the way back up the halyard, and out of the deep cold, and into the light. Somebody, somewhere near you right now, is your ditch and your storm, and your buried notebook full of terrible arithmetic. And somebody is your halyard, the one line you did not know you were still strong enough to trust with the whole standing rig, the one that will raise your sail again if you will only let it be tied on. Open your hands. Let the dead keep their careful books in the dark where the truth waits patient as a swimmer for the right swell to carry it home. And let the living keep you. Let them run out across the meadow after nothing at all, and let them wheel around, and let them come racing back up the hill to where you are standing. That is the whole of it. That is the entire benediction, and there is no other. Go now, and open your hands, and be found.